In September 1993, a truck appeared at European trade shows that would end a century of British dominance in heavy transport. The Volvo FH was originally introduced in late 1993, with development taking 7 years. British hauliers, who had spent decades conquering European routes with ERF Eurolines, Leyland road trains and Bedford TMs, were about to discover something unsettling. The FH12 won the International Truck of the Year award in 1994. The Swedish truck didn't just compete with British lorries, it made them irrelevant. This is the story of how one Swedish truck manufacturer systematically dismantled an entire British industry, one driver at a time. To understand what the Volvo FH achieved, you need to understand what British trucks were like before it arrived. Picture this: a Leyland road train driver finishing his shift in the early 1990s. British trucks often had inadequate seating, no radios, and sleeper cabs were few and far between. The cab was noisy, cramped, and built for endurance rather than comfort. British manufacturers had built their reputations on reliability and mechanical simplicity. Driver comfort was considered a luxury, not a necessity. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, Volvo was quietly revolutionizing what a truck cab could be. The Swedish company had been building trucks since 1928, but by the 1980s, they were studying something British manufacturers had overlooked. They were studying drivers themselves. Swedish engineers spent months interviewing long-haul drivers, measuring noise levels in existing cabs, and analysing the ergonomics of daily trucking life. What they discovered would reshape the entire European trucking industry. The development of the Volvo FH took 7 years and involved developing an all-new 12-litre engine with an overhead camshaft and electronic unit injector technology. But the real revolution wasn't under the hood, it was in the cab. The new FH cab was produced from hot-dip galvanized high-tensile steel and was more aerodynamically efficient, with improved ergonomics while reducing overall weight by almost 30%. When the first FH prototype rolled out of the Volvo factory in Gothenburg, it represented something unprecedented in European trucking. The cab featured a more sharply raked windscreen, and the entire structure had been extensively tested in wind tunnels to minimize air drag and improve fuel efficiency. The cab featured wedge-shaped sides rounded into the front panel at much wider radius corners, and the rear vision mirrors were also streamlined. But the real shock came when drivers climbed inside. The interior was unlike anything built in Britain. The seats were fully adjustable, the dashboard was ergonomically designed, and the noise level was dramatically reduced compared to conventional truck cabs. Most importantly, the sleeper area was actually designed for human habitation, not just emergency overnight stops. The cabin was subject to the toughest cab impact tests of the era, involving placing a 15-ton static weight on the roof and a 1-ton pendulum striking the cab's rear wall and windscreen pillars, after which the cab doors still had to be able to be opened. Safety wasn't an afterthought, it was fundamental to the design philosophy. The timing of the FH's arrival couldn't have been more devastating for British manufacturers. The European single market was launched on January 1st, 1993. With the launch of the single market, barriers to the exchange of goods and services fell, and trucks could cross borders without stopping. For the first time, British hauliers were competing directly against continental operators on truly level ground. The single European market meant that a British haulage company could no longer rely on protected domestic routes. They were now competing for European contracts against German, French, and Scandinavian operators. The Cecchini Commission revealed that trucking companies had historically suffered losses of €8 billion due to internal administrative costs and delays at borders, corresponding to approximately 2% of transnational goods value. With those barriers removed, efficiency became paramount. British truck manufacturers had built their businesses around a captive domestic market. Suddenly, that market was part of a much larger competitive landscape. And into this new reality came the Volvo FH, precisely at the moment when British hauliers needed to make critical decisions about their European fleets. The FH offered something British manufacturers had never prioritised: driver retention. Driving an FH was like getting out of an old Land Rover into a Bentley, and it wasn't long before decent drivers refused to work for companies that used older British trucks. Word spread quickly through the close-knit British trucking community. Drivers who had spent years grinding through uncomfortable shifts in British cabs discovered what continental drivers had been experiencing for years. The contrast was stark and immediate. A driver finishing a week's work in a Leyland road train would climb into an FH demonstration truck and find himself in a genuinely civilized working environment. The cab was quieter, warmer, and better designed. The seating was adjustable in ways British manufacturers had never considered. Most importantly, the overnight accommodation was actually livable. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about professional respect. The FH demonstrated that truck manufacturers could treat drivers as skilled professionals rather than expendable labour. British manufacturers had assumed that drivers would accept whatever they were given, as long as the mechanical components were reliable. In 1995, the Volvo FH series became the first heavy-duty truck to be fitted with an SRS driver's airbag to further improve passive safety. Safety innovations continued throughout the 1990s, with features that British manufacturers wouldn't adopt for years. The effect on British truck manufacturing was swift and brutal. Leyland Trucks merged with DAF in 1987 and was subject to a management buyout in 1993 when DAF went bust, before being acquired by US truck giant Passacar in 1998. ERF was acquired by MAN with manufacturing moved to Germany, Foden was integrated with Leyland Trucks, and Scammell disappeared entirely. By the late 1990s, the transformation was complete. Companies stopped buying British trucks because decent drivers preferred not to work for operators using them. British manufacturers had focused on the bottom line while ignoring driver comfort, and the very drivers who had built British trucking's reputation were walking away from their vehicles. The FH range became one of the most successful truck series ever, having sold nearly 1.4 million units worldwide. But success in the global market was built on the foundations of what happened in Europe during the 1990s. The FH hadn't just won market share, it had changed what European drivers expected from their working environment. The irony was bitter for British industry observers. The country that had invented the steam locomotive, pioneered diesel technology, and built trucks for the empire had been outmaneuvered by a Swedish company that simply asked drivers what they wanted and then built it. British bosses kept repeating the mistake of not listening to the people behind the wheel. That mistake took a very real physical toll. Before the FH arrived, chronic back pain, nerve damage and hearing loss were just accepted as the normal cost of driving a heavy goods vehicle. British designers treated the driver's body as a shock absorber for the road. Volvo treated the road as a hazard to the driver. Swedish engineers spent years analysing spinal compression and low-frequency vibrations. They redesigned the steering column angles to relieve shoulder tension. They isolated the entire cab structure from the chassis to block engine noise. They turned the cab into a shield rather than a punishment. Today, the Swedish dominance established by the original FH continues into the electric age. The new Volvo FH, FM and FMX electric trucks are rolling out to markets starting in 2026, with the FH Air 100 range capable of driving up to 700 kilometers on one charge. The same brand that ended the British diesel lorry era is now leading the transition to electric commercial vehicles. The new truck is adapted to the megawatt charging system standard. Charging 8 battery packs from 20% to 80% takes approximately 50 minutes, which can be done seamlessly within the legislated rest period for truck drivers in the EU. Once again, Volvo is thinking about the driver's working life, not just the machine's capabilities. The continuity is remarkable. From the F88 of the 1970s through the revolutionary FH of the 1990s to today's electric FH trucks, Volvo has maintained a consistent focus on the driver experience. Meanwhile, Britain's truck manufacturing industry has effectively disappeared, surviving only as assembly operations for foreign-owned companies. Leyland Trucks remains based in Lancashire, but has been a subsidiary of PACCAR since 1998, building DAF-designed trucks for the global market. The British truck brands that once competed across Europe and the empire exist only in preservation societies and transport museums. The question that haunts British industrial policy is simple. Why was the best truck no longer being built in Britain? The answer lies in the industrial culture that the FH exposed. British manufacturers had spent decades building reliable, functional machines while ignoring the humans who operated them. They had prioritized mechanical engineering over human factors, assuming that drivers would accept whatever they were given as long as it didn't break down. The Volvo FH proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Drivers, given the choice, selected the tool that treated them as skilled professionals. The Swedish understanding of driver needs wasn't revolutionary revolutionary technology. It was basic industrial psychology applied to product development. British manufacturers had simply never considered it worth investigating. The British drivers who fell in love with the Volvo FH weren't being disloyal to their country. They were making rational decisions about their working lives. A professional driver, spending 60 hours a week in a truck cab, naturally preferred the environment that acknowledged their humanity, rather than merely their ability to operate controls. The FH's victory over British trucks was complete because it was built on an understanding that British manufacturers never developed. Volvo recognized that trucks aren't just machines. They are workplaces. The driver isn't just an operator, they are a skilled professional whose comfort and safety directly affect productivity and retention. The cab isn't just a control room, it is a second home. This understanding revolutionized European trucking, but it also ended a century of British leadership in commercial vehicle manufacturing. The country that had exported trucks to every corner of the world found itself importing the expertise it had overlooked. The Volvo FH didn't just beat British trucks in the marketplace. It demonstrated that British industrial culture had fundamentally misunderstood what drivers needed from their working environment. Fleet operators eventually had to face a harsh financial truth. The premium price tag of a Swedish truck was quickly offset by the money saved on recruitment and training. When a haulage company bought an FH, their best drivers stayed. When they bought British, the turnover was relentless. It became a brutal lesson in modern transport economics. A fleet is only as reliable as the people willing to sit behind the wheel. By ignoring the human element, British boardrooms didn't just alienate the workforce. They alienated the transport companies that had loyally bought their heavy goods vehicles for generations. Today, as Volvo leads the electric truck revolution, with the same defined the original FH, Britain's truck manufacturing legacy exists mainly in heritage centres and enthusiast gatherings. The Swedish commitment to human-centred design that began with the FH continues to shape the future of European transport, while British commercial vehicle manufacturing remains a memory of what industrial leadership once looked like. The Volvo FH story is ultimately about respect. Respect for the professional skill of truck drivers, respect for their working conditions, and respect for their role in the European transport system. British manufacturers had the engineering capability to build trucks like the FH. They simply never understood why they should. That failure of imagination cost Britain an entire industry, one Swedish innovation at a time.